Welcome to The Debate. Imagine sitting across from a hiring manager for, a job you desperately want. You know your field inside and out.
Right. You've got the resume for it.
Exactly. You have the experience. But because this interview is in your second language, the moment a complex question is asked, your brain it completely crashes. The professional knowledge is still in there, obviously.
But you just can't get to it.
Right. The linguistic bridge required to get it out has just collapsed under the pressure. So your hands start shaking, you lose your vocabulary, and you experience a total cognitive freeze.
It's a terrifying scenario, and it's surprisingly common, honestly. Usually when we talk about professional expertise, there's this expectation of immediate, frictionless access to your knowledge.
Like it should just be there.
You just blank.
Yeah, and today, we are examining a methodology designed to cure that exact panic. The framework we're looking at advocates for this technique called shadowing to master the professional job interview.
Shadowing, right.
Yeah. Shadowing is the practice of listening to an English sentence and immediately repeating it out loud, like an echo. So the central question we are exploring today is this. Does the shadowing technique fundamentally transform a language learner's fluency by rewiring their brain to stop translating?
Or does this text-heavy reliance on mimicking highly specific interview scripts merely train candidates to recite memorized answers?
Right. I will argue that shadowing successfully builds the physiological and cognitive muscle memory required for genuine automatic fluency under pressure.
And I will argue that the text methodology risks conflating the rote memorization of rehearsed scripts with actual adaptable communication.
To start, I think we really need to look at how this text diagnoses the root of the problem, that shaking hands phenomenon, forgetting basic English sentences during an interview. The text explicitly clarifies that these are not issues of intelligence.
No, not at all.
They stem from a lack of real-world speaking practice.
Which I have to say is a very fair and accurate diagnosis.
Right. And it introduces shadowing as the direct solution because it forces the brain to bypass that slow, native language translation process. If we break down the typical cognitive load of an English learner, they are hearing English, right? Then they're translating it into their native language, formulating a response in that native language, translating it back to English, and then finally speaking.
It's exhausting.
It is. That four-step process is what causes the cognitive freeze. By echoing speech immediately, just 10 to 15 minutes a day, the learner forces the brain to think directly in English. It trains the literal mouth muscles, providing a solid physiological foundation for high-stress situations.
Look, I acknowledge the very appealing promise of calm, professional confidence here. I mean, who wouldn't want to walk into an interview room and speak smoothly without that four-step translation delay?
Exactly. It's the dream.
But there is a fundamental contradiction at the core of this methodology. On one hand, it promises natural and honest communication. But on the other hand, it heavily relies on learners echoing highly prescriptive, rigidly defined scripts.
When you say prescriptive, how far are we talking?
I'm talking about echoing specifics down to names and degrees. The text actually instructs learners to repeat sentences like, "My name is David, and I recently graduated with a degree in business management."
Well, it's an example.
It even explicitly notes that this shadowing technique is widely used by actors to learn lines. But treating a dynamic, inherently unpredictable job interview like a scripted acting performance leaves candidates incredibly vulnerable,
Vulnerable how?
Well, they might sound flawless delivering the rehearsed monologue, but they are left entirely exposed the second an unpredictable follow-up question breaks the script.
I see that, but I think we need to separate the underlying mechanics of fluency from the specific examples used to teach it. Let's dig into the physiological and cognitive claims being made here.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics.
The methodology states that shadowing improves speaking speed, listening ability, and natural English expressions. Because the core issue in an interview isn't just knowing the vocabulary, right? It's the latency.
The processing delay.
Yes, exactly, the processing delay. Shadowing physically interrupts that inefficient translation loop. When you hear a word and instantly speak it out loud, you are firing auditory processing neurons and motor neurons simultaneously.
Okay, sure, they fire together.
And over time, that simultaneous firing literally thickens the neural pathways. It's a vehicle for neuroplasticity. You are building the physical capability for real-time simultaneous language production.
I come at it from a different way, because we have to ask what is actually being produced during that real-time event.
What do you mean?
Well, the methodology claims this helps learners produce natural responses. But if a learner is simply repeating an echo, literally just saying exactly what they heard milliseconds prior, are they actually generating language? Or are they just pressing play on a neurological recording?
You don't think there's value in training that neurological recording?
I think there's a profound difference between mimicry and generation. When a learner perfectly echoes a complex sentence, their brain gets a massive hit of dopamine. It feels incredible.
Right, that builds confidence.
It feels like fluency, but it creates a dangerous illusion of comprehension. You are copying the rhythm, the tone, and the exact syntax of a recording, which might make you sound incredibly fluent for exactly 30 seconds.
But that 30 seconds is crucial.
But you didn't generate the syntax, you just surfed the wave of the recording. This masks a candidate's actual conversational ability, setting up a false impression for the interviewer that will inevitably shatter later in the conversation.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Mimicry isn't the end goal. It's the necessary scaffolding.
Scaffolding?
Yes, you cannot generate spontaneous, fluent language if you do not have a subconscious repository of sentence structures to draw from.
But does echoing actually build that repository for spontaneous use?
Absolutely. By echoing the audio, candidates are internalizing the syntax deeply enough that it becomes automatic. In high-stress environments, automaticity is exactly what you need to prevent the mind from going blank.
Right, but
Let me just finish this point. You aren't just pressing play on a recording. You are laying down the neurological tracks so that when you do need to generate your own thoughts, the grammatical structures are already there. They're ready to be deployed without conscious effort.
But we can't separate the physical mechanics of speaking from the words actually being spoken. We really need to look at what specific tracks this methodology is laying down.
Okay.
It hands learners highly specific, prepackaged answers to complex behavioral questions.
Such as the classic trap questions, yeah.
Exactly. Take the notorious question, "What is your weakness?" The text provides this verbatim response to echo. "One weakness I used to have was public speaking. However, I started practicing regularly and became more confident."
A great answer.
It goes on to claim that this is a professional answer because it demonstrates honesty and growth.
Which it does. I mean, formulating a strategic, culturally appropriate answer to a trick question like, "What is your weakness?" is hard enough in your native language.
Sure, it's tricky.
So the approach provides a brilliantly structured example of how to frame a weakness as a past challenge that has been actively overcome. Those are exactly the qualities that companies actively look for.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Let's really examine the claim of honesty here.
Okay, let's examine it.
Think about this from the other side of the desk. If you are a hiring manager listening to this, ask yourself, how honest does it sound if 3 candidates in a row walk into your office and literally echo the exact same rehearsed weakness about public speaking?
You're assuming they won't adapt it to their own experiences.
I'm assuming they will do exactly what they've trained their brain to do under pressure. If a candidate uses this shadowed response, you don't hear honesty. You hear a polished facade.
I wouldn't call it a facade.
And what happens when the interviewer says, "Oh, that's an interesting journey. What specific cognitive techniques did you use to overcome your fear of public speaking?" The candidate is suddenly off script.
Well,
If all they have trained is how to perfectly mimic the rhythm of a pre-written answer, they will collapse when asked to engage in a genuine dialogue. Are we preparing professionals to actually converse, or are we just directing actors for a one-man show?
I see where you're coming from, but there's a big assumption built into that critique. You're assuming the intent is for the learner to blindly recite the script forever without ever substituting their own reality.
It's what they're practicing.
Let me offer an analogy. Think of a jazz musician.
Okay, I'm listening.
A jazz musician practices highly structured, incredibly rigid scales for hours, every single day. They don't do this because they intend to walk onto a stage at a jazz club and just play a C major scale for the audience, right?
Right, obviously not.
They do it so that the mechanical execution of the notes, the finger placement, the breath control, becomes so second nature that when they are on stage, under the hot lights, they can improvise effortlessly.
So the scripted answers are the scales.
Yes. The specific script, "My name is David," or "My weakness is public speaking," is just a scale. It teaches the pragmatics of the language. It teaches candidates what professional, measured English actually sounds and feels like in the mouth. Once the candidate masters the rhythm, the flow, and the confident cadence, they naturally start substituting their own name, their own degree, their own genuine weakness. The text explicitly states that fluency comes from practice, not perfection. It's building a baseline of calm, energetic confidence.
That's a clever analogy, but a musical scale is abstract. It's the fundamental building block of all music. "My name is David and I have a degree in business management" is highly particular.
It's just a framework, though.
But this text isn't teaching the fundamental building blocks of English grammar. It is teaching learners to mime a very specific song. If you only ever practice playing "Mary Had a Little Lamb," you can't suddenly play a John Coltrane solo just because you swap out a few lyrics.
That's a bit of an exaggeration.
Is it? The muscle memory is tied to the specific words, not an abstract grammatical structure.
I'd argue the muscle memory is tied to the emotional regulation and the cadence, which absolutely translates to other sentences. Look at how the text advises candidates to handle the end of the interview.
The question section.
Yes, it prepares them to actively ask questions, like asking about the team culture or opportunities for growth. That ensures the candidate maintains that professional energy from start to finish. They are practicing the physical posture of a confident professional.
You know, if we pivot from the specific lyrics of the song to the physical act of singing, I will actually concede a major point to your position here.
Oh, glad to hear it.
Yeah, while I have deep reservations about the prescriptive nature of the scripts, the emphasis on consistency and the physical act of speaking out loud is profoundly correct. I agree completely with the assertion that English fluency is like building a muscle.
It is a physical act. And the methodology makes a fantastic observation here. It points out that many English learners quit speaking practice because they feel immense embarrassment about their accents or their grammar mistakes.
Precisely. And this gets into the psychology of language acquisition. There is a concept known as the affective filter.
The affective filter, right?
It's essentially an emotional barrier built out of anxiety, self-doubt, and fear of judgment that literally prevents the brain from acquiring and producing language. When that filter is high, you can't speak, no matter how much vocabulary you know.
Which is exactly what causes the cognitive freeze in the interview room.
Right. And the psychological tactic used here to lower that filter is excellent. It explicitly tells learners to stop silently studying grammar rules.
Yeah, silent study is safe.
It protects the ego. You can sit in your room reading a textbook and feel very smart, but silent study does absolutely nothing to prepare you for the cognitive load of a live, high-stakes conversation.
Because you aren't vibrating your vocal cords, you aren't managing your breath while formulating thoughts.
Exactly. By instructing learners to record their voices, to speak out loud daily, and to push through the embarrassment of hearing their own mistakes, the text forces them to confront the affective filter head on.
That's a huge hurdle to clear.
It is. Even if I believe they are practicing a rigid script, the mere physical act of verbalizing English out loud, training the ears and the voice together daily in an auditory feedback loop, that is undeniably effective for overcoming that initial paralyzing fear.
And it goes further by reassuring the learner that even native speakers make mistakes. That shifts the perspective entirely, don't you think?
It does take the pressure off a bit.
It frames the daily 10 to 15 minutes of shadowing not as a test of perfection, but as a gradual strengthening process. If you do this every day, your brain stops viewing the act of producing English as a sudden, terrifying emergency. It starts viewing it as a familiar, daily habit.
It is certainly a far more active, engaging form of preparation than simply reading a list of the top 10 common interview questions and quietly thinking about what you might say.
Oh, absolutely.
The physical engagement of the vocal cords, tying the motor function to the auditory processing, that is a fundamentally sound pedagogical approach to language acquisition. I just wish the content being shadowed wasn't so heavily scripted.
Well, it seems we've charted a pretty clear map of the two sides of this methodology today. To summarize my position, I maintain that shadowing as a daily discipline is a transformative and foundational practice. By actively forcing the brain to bypass the slow translation process and echo English directly, learners can overcome the debilitating physical and mental panic of job interviews. They build the literal cognitive and physical muscle memory required to speak with the automatic, natural confidence of a seasoned professional. The specific scripts aren't meant to be permanent straitjackets. They are simply the scaffolding that allows that neuroplasticity to occur in the first place.
And from my perspective, while I fully recognize that out loud shadowing effectively strengthens pronunciation and helps learners overcome the severe embarrassment of speaking, I maintain my strong reservations about the illusion of comprehension.
The Mary had a little lamb problem.
Exactly. An over-reliance on reciting highly specific, scripted responses, especially when it comes to framing personal narratives like weaknesses, risks creating a polished facade rather than true, adaptable linguistic competence. If a candidate learns only to deliver a rehearsed monologue, they remain dangerously unprepared for the unpredictable, dynamic reality of a genuine professional dialogue.
Yet, despite that tension, I think we have found a highly significant point of convergence today. Regardless of whether the scripts are too rigid or perfectly calibrated for beginners, we both entirely agree with the core directive here.
Which is that consistent, out loud practice is far superior to silent study.
Absolutely. Overcoming the sheer ego-driven embarrassment of using the language and lowering that effective filter is half the battle.
How candidates can further transition from this guided, echoed shadowing into truly spontaneous conversation.
It really highlights the incredible complexity of mastering a second language, especially when your career, your livelihood, and your future are on the line. We will leave it to the listener to look at their own practice habits and determine if echoing is the ultimate key to fluency or just the necessary first step on the road to true adaptability.
A lot to think about before the next interview.
Definitely. But whatever the answer, it brings us back to that terrifying moment we discussed at the start, when you sit down in the interview chair. The hiring manager looks at you, and you realize you can't just rely on what you know. You have to rely on what your brain and your body are trained to do in that exact moment to keep the mind from going completely blank.